chapter 3, and I'm just going to refer to a couple of these and give some meaning to them and some application. Solomon writes in Proverbs 3 that we are to honor the Lord from our wealth and from the first fruits of our produce. Now that's an interesting parallel phrase there. When in an agricultural society, oftentimes the first crop, the first cutting from something that's grown, the firstborn animal would be the best or the purest or the richest in value to that particular farmer or agrarian. So the notion of giving from the first of all of our produce is giving of our best. And the people that lived in that society would have been able to affiliate with that. They would have known exactly what that means when they hear that. Again, unless you're raised in that setting today, you may not recognize that. The first cutting in the field for hay is usually the richest hay. And then a second and a third and sometimes a fourth cutting doesn't produce the same quality or volume, particularly quality. Back in Ohio, when we cut our first cutting of hay, usually in May, it had the most clover in it, and the clover was the richest portion of the hay that added the macronutrients that were needed for the animals. The clover would not regrow a second or a third time, although the rest of the grassiness would grow. So you could get a second or third cutting of hay, for example, but it wouldn't have that rich additive of clover in it. So that's a perfect example of that. Go down a few verses. How blessed is the man who finds wisdom, the man who gains understanding. In this particular verse, the word man is gender neutral. That's referencing individual. So how blessed it is that we find wisdom and we gain understanding. Subsequent verse which parallels it, for its profit is better than the profit of silver, and its gain is better than the gain of fine gold. So now Solomon, and this is the Lord speaking through Solomon, so the Lord has just told you that you will be blessed if you find wisdom and if you gain an understanding in such a way that it is more profitable to you than that of silver and more of a gain in your life than that of gold. Well, again, back in those days, and still ever so present today, the one who finds silver and gold, the one who goes after in business to gain in wealth, would always try to gain in silver and gold. That eager or longing desire to grow in your wealth by doing good business is that longing or that desire that God wants you to have to grow in your knowledge and wisdom. He's saying it's more valuable than the greatest valuable commodities of their time and still to our time today. So something about the wisdom and the knowledge and understanding that God dispenses, He in His economy places a greater value on that than any other article on this earth that has value, that being gold and silver. Let's look at one more. I have all these marked. Ill-gotten gain does not profit. Righteousness delivers from death. Ill-gotten gain does not profit. Doing bad business never does you good. Ill-gotten gain. Cheating somebody never makes you feel good inside. Ill-gotten gain does not profit. You might harm someone for a little bit of gain, but in the end it is not profitable to you. Righteousness delivers from death. Righteousness, walking a righteous life, will deliver you from death. So maybe he's referring to the notion that ill-gotten gain actually leads to death. Now, it's not a direct reference, it'd be an indirect reference. So ill-gotten gain is not only not profitable to you, but it might be just the opposite. It might have significant consequences. How many of you know when you steal and the police catch you, they throw you in jail? There's certain things you do in life when there's consequences associated with that. And if you defraud somebody of their finances, whether you do it personally or professionally in business, you'll go to jail, trust me. So ill-gotten gain is not only not profitable, it has consequences. Righteousness delivers you from death. Righteousness. We'll stop right there. I'm in chapter 10 now. And we'll continue on as we study God's Word and His view of finances. Let's pray and then we'll talk about collegiate finances. So Lord, we just thank you for bringing us together today. Lord, help us to be men and women who seek to walk in righteousness. Lord, who pursue you and the goodness that you have, the knowledge and wisdom that you want to dispense to us. Lord, help us grow in our understanding through our Christian worldview, Lord, as we approach life and do it your way. Help us to learn how to do finances your way, to value money the way you value it, and to do good, healthy business the way you designed it. Lord, shape us as men and women, future sport managers and coaches and sport ministers with great stewardship. Lord, in this we pray, Father. Amen. So today I'm actually going to go into the PowerPoint, and I'll do a little bit of that, and then I've got an assignment coming out of today. This one will probably take about 2 days to walk through. And so it might be a good idea for you to start studying stuff in Module 2. Module 1's examination's been entirely graded. And you can go back, not right now, but you can go back and look at your final score on that. Can you see okay with the light off?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, okay. Is the podium in the way?
It's not.
Okay, good. I do have that. So what I want to do today is kind of introduce some macro scope of finances in collegiate athletics. And then we'll dive a little bit deeper in the next couple class periods. We'll have an assignment ourselves that'll bring us up to speed on that as well. And so when you engage in your own personal learning, it tends to be more meaningful and has a greater impact. Engaging in the art of education generally, because you're visual learners and kinesthetic learners and modeling learners, the more you can engage in the learning process, the more you're going to generate out of it. So we don't want to be just passive listeners. Remember, the Bible says, don't be just hearers of the word. Be doers. There's a big difference there. So we're going to talk about collegiate athletics, and then this will spring us to the next section, which is professional athletics and finances. So there's a lot of innuendos and things that go on. That's why I laid the foundation with some terms. I think today we'll see subsidy and subsidize a few times, and a few other things that'll kind of help recollect as we. It's good to learn terms and concepts before you dive into the heart of the matters, because it helps you kind of weave through it a little bit. But intercollegiate athletic finance is something we have tracked for decades, particularly since the 1980s, when college sports started to really become big business. And we started to see the advancements in telecom and cable television, and the ability to produce thousands of college sport events, produce them for the public. So we had always held college sporting events, and prior to really the advancement of television and radio getting involved, we would always produce our football games and our softball games and our soccer games and our lacrosse. They would always be done just for the local public. Most college sport, up until the 1970s and 1980s, was largely produced just for the institution and its graduates and its alumni and its people, the local community. It never had, with few exceptions other than the large institutions that did the national bowl games and the national basketball tournament, it never had large-scale appeal across all sports across the globe. And that changed tremendously in the 80s. It started, the transitory change started in the 1980s, extended in the 1990s when cable television and telecom and the internet all really started to evolve. And we see this large-scale mass production of sporting events being broadcast onto cable television and Sports South and all these networks. And then that opened up audiences for people around the world. And one of the things that really did was it helped develop the concept of fandom, F-A-N-D-O-M-E, fandom. And so the notion of fandom is that I can be a fan of the Ohio State Buckeyes and never have to live in Ohio, never have to go back, never have to visit Columbus. I don't have to even know where it is on the map. I can just be a supportive fan and be remotely removed from that. So the advent of cable television and satellite and virtual programming and the ability for the networks to produce large, medium-sized, and even small-scale sporting events and then broadcast them, not just regionally, not just locally, but nationally and then internationally. What that did for college sport, we'll see the same thing for professional sport, but what that did for college sport was that began to open the can of the availability of market share so that we can attract fans, the notion of fandom, we can attract long-scale fans to be supporters of those programs, those institutions, and not have to live in that community. Because before that, you had to go to the events, or you had to get the local newspaper to read about it in that local community. So we went from producing sporting events, for the most part, we went from producing them just for our local audiences to producing them for the large-scale, broad-based audiences. And then out of that came an ability to generate more revenues for the programs through sponsorship and endorsements and ticket sales and broadcast rights fees and conference distributions and all those things. I quickly ticked off them the other day, but we're going to see how they're integrated. The ability to broadcast and enhance the audiences and become more international and grow our fandom, our fan bases, allowed us to produce more revenue. And it really goes back to classic business, is that when you grow the business, you generate more revenue. And so the ability to mass produce and globalize, for the longest time was nationalized, but it's now globalized. Let's just say nationalized sporting events. Institutions, particularly those in the mid-majors or mid-level, were able to generate revenues they never had access before. And larger institutions were able to double and triple and quadruple and fivefold and sixfold the amount of revenue that they were previously able to generate. And so then that resulted in an ability to expand and develop new stadiums, new arenas, new convention centers, particularly for the Division I institutions. It began to allow Division II and Division III, other schools, to begin to renovate and build with the hopes of having a marquee program where you can get national attention and broadcasting and yada, yada, yada. So it was very good for us in college sports to go through, to watch society go through the advent of the internet and cable television and satellite programming, and then the ability to mass produce and sell. We now package and sell our collegiate sport events to these networks so that they can produce it on TV for a TV audience. So that is the backstory of us being able to generate more revenue and do more things, which then allows us to, grow the programs. But in the context of all that is that athletic departments continued, and they always would do, and they always will, to spend exorbitant amounts of money on the programs. And that's probably something that most of us would miss, is that we only look at the revenue sides and we get kind of ecstatic about that. We don't realize that running college athletics is a very expensive business. So one of the real nominal features here is to be able to recognize to what extent college athletic departments actually spend money and operate, what it takes to functionally operate in a very fiscal manner, college athletic departments. So, and I'll do some historical review from time to time. I'll go back and forward. And we always look at relevant real-time numbers, but it's always good to look at data points. Data points give us points of reference, but also help us understand. So by 2000, let's just say by the turn of the 21st century, college athletics was about a $4 billion annual industry, and that would include all of the revenue and expenditures, the inflows and outflows of that. And by 2000, there were, and again, you don't have to write all this down, the PowerPoints are listed in Blackboard. When I update them, I always update them then in Blackboard. So I was working on this one yesterday and again today. But there were about 1,256 institutions that offered men and women's programs. In the previous decade, there were 1,183 programs. So that means we had about 60 or 70, 73 programs that were added that offered some form of collegiate athletics. Today there are 1,413 institutions that offer some form of collegiate athletics. That includes NAIA and JUCOs and schools like, even like Bob Jones, that just offer 1 or 2 sport programs or whatever that number is. So that could be everything from startups to those that have been around 100, 150 years. So we're talking about an industry that has roughly 1,400 institutional providers of college athletics. So when you look at the macro numbers of, well, okay, the cost of running college athletics in 2000 across 1,256 institutions was roughly $4 billion. The amount of growth from the 90s to the 2000s was 73 programs, or if you divide that out, it grew about 5.8%. So one of the things we can note from that right away is this is not an industry that grows. There are not more programs coming online year after year after year after year. So what happens is we're not building new universities around the country in an alarming rate. At best, most states might have one institution that they're revamping or one institution that they're building, but most states don't have ongoing construction projects of new universities that offer college athletic departments. So this is basically a playing field, where the number of competitors is predominantly locked. Now, what you may have is a couple of schools will step up into college athletics, like Bob Jones always offered recreational sports, and then they finally started some collegiate athletic programs. You might have other schools that step down out of it. So you have them going both ways. So in large scale, the number doesn't change a whole lot. We built a series of institutions in the 80s and 90s. But for the most part, most states are saturated with the number of institutions that offer higher education, and therefore institutions that offer collegiate athletic programs. You'll see these numbers trickle up and down every so often. And 5% is a lot, and throughout the 1990s, 70 new programs is quite a few. You'll see, so what happens is the number of providers is fairly static, and that static is stationary. But the ability of those static providers to be able to generate more or less may waver tremendously, and that's what we'll look at as we kind of go forward. Let's see here. Yes, so by the turn of the 21st century, college athletics was a $4 billion industry. In the following decade, it became an $8.7 billion industry, which is about 100% growth. That's tremendous. Now today, it's even doubled beyond that. So in the next decade, it advanced to an $18.8 billion industry. Now, the part of that's inflation, so as cost of doing business goes up, and we can talk about what inflation is. I think next week we have an actual inflation day where we do nothing but inflation. But beyond that, the ability for the current programs to generate more revenue, or the ability for them to spend more, meaning the cost of doing business goes up. The inflation, both that's driven by greed, price inflation, but also just taking on more business. Institutions that add more programs, for example, will increase their costs. So if every one of these 1,400 programs added another sport team or two, you might see that go up by, $300-400 million, something along those lines. And so part of the growth is inflation, part of it is expansion. And there's a difference there. Inflation is when the cost just goes up. There's a number of things that drive it and draw it. So stuff's being pushed and stuff's being pulled. But also the market expansion. So the more programs we added, when I first came to North Greenville, we had 5 or 6 or 7 less sport programs in 2001. And during my tenure here, we've added, I can name at least 5 or 6 or 7 different sport programs. We've not eliminated any, but we've added them. So there's been expansion in the athletic offerings. And therefore, that requires an overall expansion in the athletic budgets. Now, that's before you even get to cost inflation. So annual operating budgets for institutions that have football programs in the early 20th century was about $20 million. So the annual operating budget is always first set on the amount of cost that it takes for a program to break even. So when I talk about the budget, in particular the annual operating budget, that is always an indication of what it costs to run the business for one full annual year. Now that could be a calendar, 12 months, or it could be annualized, maybe fall and spring sports and when they end. So the annual budget for a program that had major football and basketball was about $20 million at the turn of the 21st century. And then out of that, those men's teams would then support the athletic department by providing 55% of the revenue. Women's teams would contribute about 15% of the revenue, and the remaining 30% was not categorized by sport program. That would be just general donations and sponsorship and other forms of broadcast rates, fees, so the other forms of revenues that were not tied to one specific program, they would be more general. So we can categorize revenues now, the cost of running the business at $20 million, and the differentiating of where revenue is subrogated doesn't tell us whether or not they're profitable, they have surplus or deficit. Again, we're just looking at some of the breakdowns of the athletic department before we get into understanding how they're doing and why they're doing how they're doing. So today, the annual cost of an athletic department with major football and basketball is right at $100 million. That's a 5-fold increase in 20 years. That's quite extensive. There's a lot of factors that drive the expansion and the inflation of that. That would be everything from number of coaches and number of players on the teams to number of scholarships we give out to the amount of product that goes into running major football and major basketball programs. But whatever those factors are, and there's a lot of them we'll look at, the cost today to run a major athletic department is 5 times what it cost 20 years ago. Now, if you're an actuary or an economist, that should alarm you. If you're a financier like me, that may or may not be troubling. Again, it's only one side of the ledger, meaning the cost of that. If the revenues go up 6-fold and it costs me 5-fold to get there, that's always a good thing. Now let me stop and address that for a minute, and I want to make sure I talk too fast. I flow in finance, so if I get ahead of some of you, that's not a good thing. So if it costs me $5 to make $6, that's a good thing. In fact, I would buy that every time. I just would keep giving you $5 bills, and you'd give me $6 back. And we would never stop that. So there's a return on investment at least of 20%, which is $1 over the $5, that gets you to 6. So looking at the expense side here, we know that it costs more. We don't know yet how much we've benefited. If we benefit more than the cost, then it's probably worth it, at least from a fiscal perspective. Now, we're not in here to talk about sport ethics. We're not in here to talk about all the other aspects of college athletics. We're in here to talk about the money side, the finance side, and the relationship to finance and fiscal to the institutions and to what we do on the management side. So it's not a bad thing to increase cost if my return on investment justifies it. So a lot of times what folks like me and others do, presidents of universities, they would run cost-benefit analysis where they would hire outside consulting firms to come in and determine, is the cost justified in the form of a return on investment? And so consultants can do a lot of assessment. They can look at the financials, they can look at a number of variables, write up these fancy summary reports and give it to the administrators of institutions and athletic directors, and then we can really see, is it really valuable for us to be able to do this? Is it more valuable to continue to grow it? Should we contract it down to a certain point? And then go from there. So you gotta have good data, you gotta have good information to make those wise decisions. We'll soon see as we get into this a little bit, but at least we know now for whatever reason, some reason, my cost has gone up 5 times in the last 20 years. Now, that may be consistent with what's going on in the marketplace. If the cost of a hamburger 20 years ago was $1 and the cost of a hamburger today is $5, and the cost of gas was $1 and now it's $5, and the cost of a Starbucks was $1 and now it's $5, if the 5-fold increase is normal inflation increase, and it's seen pretty much across the marketplace, that's not necessarily a bad thing. But we have to individualize it in our industry, and then we look at it across all industry in the marketplace to see whether or not the growth in cost is consistent with the growth in marketplace, or is our cost outpacing the marketplace, or maybe even we're actually underpacing the marketplace, which is always a good thing. That's not a bad thing. So all of those factors we'll look at as we go forward, because they all weigh in us making these decisions. Is this the best use of our money? Now, from time to time, I'll stop and we'll look at case examples. One of the best ways to help us further understand and define is to look at a case example. And I pull lots of schools from different eras to be able to kind of itemize and assess them for you. But this is a small school out west called Brigham Young University. And in 2009, they had revenue of $41 million in the athletic department. They had expenses of $35 million. And it appears on the surface that this athletic department during this moment in time generated a surplus of $5.5 million, which is about a 15% margin. Now, we're not going to look at what factors drove that, but we want to at least drill down a little bit on that. But on the surface, you can look at macro numbers and say, well, hey, they probably had a pretty good year. Now, it may not have been their athletics that had a good year. Maybe it was their managers that had a good year. Maybe they went out and raised a ton of money and they got a donor to give $10 million. You have just no idea. You can't automatically assume which teams win, therefore that's what happens. It can be just the opposite. One donor could make up the entire difference. So when you start to drill down into the scenario, football generated about 60% of their revenue and 53% of that margin. Men's basketball generated about 15% of that revenue and 8% of that margin. Women's basketball generated less than 3% of that revenue and operated at a loss. And all the other sports in the athletic department during that year, in that moment in time, operated at a loss. They were unprofitable. So you could say, without going any further, well, obviously that year was football, men's basketball generated 75% of all the revenue, and at least 53 and 8 is 61% of the profitability that was realized in that year. Again, that doesn't tell the whole story, but it begins to peel the onion back, and you can see a little bit more of the story being told. So again, we don't know. You'd have to drill down into football and basketball. Maybe they had a donor give money for the new stadium. Maybe they had some significant sponsorship. Maybe they had 5 TV games. Maybe every team in their conference won a bowl game, and their conference distributions were just through the roof because of what others had done. So again, it doesn't tell the whole story. You have to be a little smarter now. You got to drill down into this information to kind of see. But certainly we can make some references from the surface before we go deeper. Now we'll go away from this, but then we'll come back to it a couple of times. So intercollegiate athletics, by 2010, more than 80% of the largest programs in the country were losing money because of the growth and the expenditures. The cost was outpacing the revenue being generated. In spite of the fact that revenues were growing, the costs were growing insurmountably as well. And within the next decade after that, between 2010 and 2020, nearly 95% of all institutions' athletic departments operated in the red. So in spite of the fact that some programs like a BYU might have a good year, across the 1,500 programs, most all of them really don't generate enough revenue to be self-sustaining. They couldn't stay on life support. They would have to have some assistance. If you unplug them from life support, they would die, is what that tells you. Now, there's still a lot of explanation in there. But one of the things you're going to see, and it's no different than any other industry in society, one of the things you're going to see as we go forward is that there is a separation that has occurred. And the separation continues. It is the elite programs that are doing well, and everybody else struggles in life. Now that's no different than in society. In most societies around the world, you have a ruling elite that are doing really well. You might have a small glimmer of middle class, and you have a lot of underclass social and a lot of impoverished people in the world. And so it's no different than what you see being portrayed in college athletics, is you have this Power 5 elite group of institutions that have figured out how to generate the money and get the best coaches and build the best stadiums and get all the TV games and get all the conference distributions and get all the grant monies. And man, they're just killing it. Those 30 or 40 programs are absolutely just rolling in it. And then the other 1,420 programs are struggling on life support from a fiscal perspective. They're struggling. It becomes the us and the them, the elites and everybody else. Now, you may be fine with that. We're not really making judgment of it. We're not here to make a judgment. We're assessing the data and assessing the finances and looking at the reality of the situation. We'll apply God's word to it, and we're going to apply what God says through the Christian worldview. And we can make some assertions, but we're not going to bring judgment on that. One of the things that we realized in sport education, the collegiate athletic environment has moved away since the 1980s. It has moved entirely away from being just about offering college athletics. It is entirely a business now and no longer a game. And university presidents around the country routinely identify that it's imperative to them that they hire more business-like managers of their athletic programs. Hence, the hiring of business executives with sporting backgrounds really bodes well for those of us getting bachelor's and master's in sport management. Because it is those of us who are trained in business sense, in business acumen. It is those of us who are trained in finance and marketing and communication and the ability to operate in a accounting and sales and human resource facility management, and to do it well, it bodes well for us to be hired into athletic departments. Now, I don't have to go any further than tell you that we've had a great number of our graduates out of this sport management program go on to work in college athletic departments. And even here at North Greenville, both Dustin Fools and Zach Epting are graduates of this very program. They sat in those seats 10 and 15 years ago. And now they're working as associate and senior associate athletic directors, and they're gonna have a long career. They can both go on to other institutions and move higher. Even Andre Bernardi came out of this very program. I taught him 15 years ago, and Joe Novotowski. Well, Andre Bernardi is associate athletic director at Furman, and he's got an illustrious career ahead of him. Many of you can be in those seats in a few years and have an illustrious career working in both college athletics, but becoming an athletic director at an institution. I can name several others who are either coaching in collegiate athletics or who are working in athletic administration in the collegiate environment who've come right out of this program. Now that is obviously, it goes back to what Dr. Johnson first established in us was a really high quality, high value program. We have what I think is one of the highest value laden programs because of the extensive number of courses we offer and the rigid coursework and just a number of factors, as well as a great network that we can tie into. So just a lot of good things there. So you should be, it bodes well for you, and you should be proud if for those of you that are doing well in our program, and I assume you all are, that there's a lot of outlook for you to be able to go on into the college athletic environment and excel in it. And what the presidents are identifying is university presidents around the country are identifying is they want sport business graduates who've been trained in marketing and sales and finance and event management and ethics to be able to come and work in their athletic departments because they're looking for sport-minded business executives to run their athletics department because it's no longer a business, or no longer a game, I'm sorry, it's a business. And with the amount of money that's flowing in and out, it's vital that they have people that are very business savvy to be able to do that. So that excites us, very much so. So what's the financial condition? This would be just somebody who was a former athletic director and president of an institution. You can probably count in two hands the number of athletic departments that actually have a surplus. That would have been in the late 1990s. He said that by the 1990s. It was 16%, and those numbers actually trickled down, unfortunately, a little bit as the cost kept going up. I want to teach you an aspect that was a concept that wasn't in the concepts and terms the other day, and so I'll do it by actually applying it in a 1AA example. So by the 1990s, Division 1A schools on average generated $20 million in revenue, and at the same time they generated $20 million in operating costs. The intersection of revenue and expenditures on a graph where the costs intersect with the revenues, we call that the break-even point. And that's important for us to know because the break-even point is something that we always use to establish in budgeting. When we start with zero-based budgeting or we start creating a budget or a cost initiative for an organization, we start with, okay, what's the break-even point? Where is it that my spending is matched by what we generate? Therefore, we know to spend below that and generate above that creates a surplus. So we always start at the marker that we know where break-even is. When we actually do budgeting for P&Ls, which are profit and loss statements, and balance sheets, we want to know where is it that we're going to break even, because that's my launching pad into profitability. So we'll talk about break even often, but for those of you that might not be if it's a foreign term, it's the difference between the cost and the revenue generated, and it starts at zero. So that break even is a zero-sum game. We want to build businesses that have surplus left over, where it's way more than zero-sum. One of the questions we'll ask ourselves from time to time in here is collegiate sport a worthwhile financial investment? 2009, the NCAA reported 14 of the 120 FBS programs made money in athletics. That would be about 11.6%. That's a very low percentage. But if, and only if, you stopped at that, you'd say, well, it's probably not a good investment because 89% of them are not doing well. But we certainly don't stop at that macro figure. That is a figure that we include, it is a figure we look at, but we don't stop when we assess the overall integrity and value that athletics contributes back to the university. Remember, in most universities, the athletics department is just one of hundreds of departments. Now, on great many of the campuses, it's the largest department, or it's the most well-funded department, but it certainly isn't the only department. So we have to be careful that we're not just taking college athletics and making them their own business. They're actually a part of an organization. That's something else we'll have to look at, is what is the level of value that college athletics contributes back to the overall university, and not just as a standalone entity. We must look at it as a standalone department, as a standalone entity, to be able to understand the operations of it, but then we attach it back to the university and say, hey, college athletics is just one of many departments. It is big, it is expensive, it does a lot of things for the university, but does it contribute back to the greater mission of the institution? Is there growth and decline in college sports? Something else we've got to look at. And as you start to read in the next chapter, you'll quickly see where there is growth and where there is decline. Growth in what I just mentioned 10 minutes ago, which is the fandom. The growth in the ability to have committed fans and fan bases, and to cultivate fan bases as far as Asia and in South Carolina and everywhere in the world, to be able to support programs that you may never go back and visit, or may never be a part of, or may never be on that campus ever again. The advancements of fandom through virtual and other forms of viewership is just tremendous for us. So it's been just a really a great booster shot for us that's allowed us to accelerate what we do. But, we've got to look and discern, is college sport growing? Well, that would be attendance, that would be ratings, that would be fan bases, that would be revenue. I mean, there's a lot of factors there, individual items that we'll look at. You'll see some are growing, you'll see some are flat, you'll see some are recessing or contracting, declining. The Folks Report, I think I mentioned that last class period of time or two. This is an organization that's hired by the NCAA and many private institutions around the world. They do a lot of fiscal and financial reporting of college athletics. They do a few other things too, but that report is produced annually. That's probably the most thorough financial report. It shows that in 2009, the median amount of income paid or expenditure paid by an FBS school to subsidize or support college athletics was $10 million. So one of the things we'll look at is how much does an institution actually have to support an athletic department to keep the athletic department alive and floating. And the Folks Report reported 12 years ago that the subsidy that institutions were providing the athletics department on average, and it's just an average across those 1,453 schools, 120 FBS schools, was $10 million. So one of the things that would identify for you is at least many of those 120 FBS schools were not able to be self-sustaining. Now again, what you're going to find is you're going to find some schools that make a lot of money, you're going to find some schools that break even, and you're going to find some schools that lose a lot of money. So a school like Rice University, they just lose tens of millions of dollars, and they really should get out of sports. They shouldn't even be in it. You know, so schools like that really pull the overall averages way down, where the averages could be a little bit more appealing. Maybe it's $6, $8, $5 million subsidy, but when you have an institution that loses just so much money, and there's a handful of those, they just absolutely pull it way down. There's another one in Charlotte, I think it's the UNC Charlotte, just loses tens of millions of dollars in its athletic department. They shouldn't be in athletics either. And so again, it's those kind of schools that actually pull the numbers way down, and just make it a little more less reasonable. But we have to look at those anomalies on both sides of the equation. And so, in that report that I gave you 2 weeks ago, where you read it and then answered a few questions, those come out every year, and we can sometimes have access through public disclosure and begin to look at those, how many Division I schools there are, how many Division II or III schools there are, and how many members are there at the various levels. How many NAIA members? Is it 250 NAIA members, and JUCO members? Is it 63, 73, 83? And you can begin to sort through those and look at the finances per the different level to have a better understanding. Again, we don't want to lump them all together and just say with a broad sweeping brush that these are not doing well or these are doing well. So sometimes you got to separate them by category. But one thing we're realizing is college sports is very expensive. It's very expensive to run an athlete department, and one of the reasons why is we provide so much scholarship money to athletes across the country. And so it is the goal of most institutions to provide students with a way to go to higher education, to actually be more learned. We's trying to make you guys smarter and more prepared to go make money in the market. You're going to be a professional someday, but it's not going to be in football, baseball, basketball. You will be a professional as a sport manager in the marketplace. And our goal, yeah, he thinks he is, but he's not. And our goal is to trust me. I've taught 30 years of you guys, and it's not going to happen. So you might go play for a few years in the minors. That's what some of the golfers do, or some of the baseball players do, but it never lasts. So your goal here is to prepare yourself to be a professional. Yeah, sometimes what did Dr. Fantz say something about math slaps you in the face? You might think you're a millionaire, but then when you look at your bank account and it's got $40 in there, you're not really a millionaire. Dr. Fant gave a great presentation. What was that? Convocation. The realities of life sometimes don't match up with your expectations. And I'm sorry if that hurts your feelings. I'm trying to be dead honest with you. I want you to be a professional as a manager, an administrator, and a coach for the Lord in the sport marketplace. And certainly pursue your athletic dreams. Trust me, I was a professional athlete for a while, so I know what that's like. But then we come back. So one thing we realize is that, man, college athletics has just gotten so expensive. We spend so much money on new facilities. We pay coaches so much money. At least the coaches at the upper levels. We absolutely just spend so much money on recruiting and so much money on scholarships, but the goal has always been, from a scholarship perspective, is to provide a way for something like, I looked at the number a few years ago, it was several million athletes every year get to study at one or more at the institutions around the world, around the country, at the expense of college athletics. And so I think we're going to look at what percentage of the overall athletic budget is allocated to student scholarships, and it's over a third of the cost. So when an athletic department costs hundreds of millions of dollars, or the overall industry is $18 million, then at least 4 or 5 million of that is going to the athletic scholarships, which is the supporting of student athletes being able to attend the institutions, which means that somebody is contributing those dollars for you guys to be in class and study and to prepare yourself to be good stewards and students so that you can go on and do great mighty things for the Lord. And that's the reality of that. So one of the things that drives athletic department's costs up is the institutional cost. So every time the institution cost goes up, the cost against the scholarship also goes up. So if I give 500 scholarships out a year, and the cost goes up 5% at the university or 10%, then now my cost for those scholarships goes up. I actually have to raise more money to give those same number of scholarships out. So institutional costs, the inflation of the marketplace has driven the cost of running athletic department way up. So we'll look at that. So is college sport? This is something we're going to discern down. Is it, or does it have an ability to be self-sustaining, self-reliant, and self-sufficient? Now, You would like to think so, but I think we've realized already, is that, yeah, for the top 40 or 50 programs in the super elite conferences, the Power 5 conferences, they have an ability to be more self-sufficient. There's an ability to generate at least a break even, and in most scenarios, the ability to generate that surplus, which is needed to be self-sufficient. But what about the other 1,400 institutions? Again, if you're in the 90%, and it's pretty much between 90 and 93, 94%, but if you're in that 90% that is unable to be self-sufficient, you will always be subsidized, always. North Greenville has always subsidized its athletics. And so do all the other schools in Conference Carolinas. Every one of them subsidizes athletics. They did before you got here. They will do long after you're gone. So self-sufficiency means that the athletic department's ability to generate operating revenue exceeds, it is above and beyond the institutional support. Unfortunately, we don't. So therefore, it's required to have institutional support. If we could generate enough revenue, if I could sell tickets to my football game at $30 or $40 a ticket, and all 4,000 fans that came, but when you're giving away free tickets to students, and you give away free tickets to this, and then you only charge for some, it's really hard to generate revenue. But it's also hard, people don't pay those prices for soccer tickets and lacrosse tickets and baseball tickets, softball tickets, the golf events, the track and field. It's just the market demand is not there. And once you realize that the market demand is only on a handful of programs, then what you really realize, it's a handful of programs that carry the athletic department. And the athletic department is largely driven by football and baseball and basketball in most athletic departments, and then all the other supportive sports, the Olympic sports and supportive sports, are actually add-ons to being carried and supported by the larger programs. So in some regards, the smaller programs need to be thankful that the larger programs are doing well, because you might not be there if it wasn't for the larger programs. So if football didn't do as well, or baseball or basketball didn't bring in as much money, many of the Olympic sports, the smaller programs simply wouldn't exist. And so I don't want to say it's a dependency, but it is a very codependent relationship we have with the larger sports that have an ability to generate larger revenues. Subsidy. Oh, here's we'll do a couple more slides and then we'll finish for the day. But these particular schools are greatly subsidized by the institutions. So taking a look at a small level of subsidy, so the University of Virginia, the institution itself only subsidizes its athletics department about 16%. So that means about 85% of the ability to self-sustain is managed in the athletic department. But then if you go right down the list, you say, well, UNC Charlotte, 89% of all of its athletic spending is subsidized by the institution. New Jersey Tech or Georgia State and Coastal Carolina, just to name a few. Most of these institutions probably should move to D3 in athletics, where they're not giving out all this money, and then you can greatly lower the cost, because what's happening is the institution has to pay all the bills. And so their student athletic fees are probably a lot higher. Their price point to charge for you to go to those schools are probably a lot higher, but basically those institutions have to foot the entire bill for one reason or another. Now, we may say, well, they just simply don't need to be in sports, or they're disadvantaged by a number of things. There's lots of ways to look at that, lots of ways to peel the onion to look at it. And we'll assess that as we go forward. But subsidy, you'll find, is very large in most all the institutions that don't break even, because the athletic departments have to be supported financially. And if they're not breaking even, the onus always falls back on the university itself. So I think I mentioned a couple years ago, the Texas student athletic fee was up to $500 a year. I think here at North Greenville we were at $35. I'll have to check on that just to see if that was a couple years ago. So where's the subsidy derived from? Well, where do universities get money? They raise it through development, and they derive it through tuition. So when an athletic department needs more money, that really means the university needs more money. So they either raise it privately or they raise the cost of you going there. So that's always the case. So again, presidents are looking for business savvy athletic directors, because presidents know that if the athletic department just spends out of oblivion, the university has to write the checks, the university has to increase their cost and their development, their annual giving, which you can only do that at what's called manageable rates. And so that's why presidents realize, man, we need some really business savvy people running our athletic departments, because we just can't keep writing these unending checks. Remember scarcity. Universities don't have open checkbooks either. Okay, one last example, and then we'll wrap it up today. James Madison University, small school north of us, in 2012, generated $34.5 million in revenue, spent $34.5 million. For some reason, it was right down to the penny, and that's because the university subsidized 79% of that. That's how they were able to get it down to the penny. Now, when you look at that ahead of time, you may say, wow, they bring in tons of money. No, they don't. They spend a lot of money. Yes, they do, and the universities want to write the checks. Oh, they need to go out of business and shut that business down. In the private sector, we had to shut that business down. Yeah, nobody loses, that's a loss of $27 million just that one year. Nobody loses $27 million on a regular basis and stays in business. That's huge. All right, so one assignment for next week. We're going to, each one of us, look at our favored athletic department, and we will put together a couple of PowerPoint slides on the finances of our favorite athletic department. Pick your favorite team, and go and investigate. Usually the institution is published, but there's lots of sources of the published information where you can find it. But put together 3 or 4 on their current spending, or maybe last year's spending, the current revenue, maybe last year's revenue, just some neat things about it. There is a socket in Module 2 in Blackboard. Upload your PowerPoints. I want to have these by Tuesday, because I want to review a bunch of them together, and then we can draw some conclusions from them, and then we'll advance next week on Thursday more into the PowerPoint. So have that done and submitted by Tuesday, please. Otherwise, start studying Module 2. Have a great day.